Good evening, and welcome to the Columbia University Institute of Latin American Studies Cuba Program's webinar entitled The Remarkable Reefs of Cuba, Hopeful Stories and Recommendations. Our speaker tonight is Dr. David Guggenheim, and the topic is, as has been suggested, the situation of the marine ecosystems and coral reefs that surround Cuba. The waters that are off Cuba's beaches are the home to highly varied marine life, including more sharks and manatees than in the waters off Florida. Environmental cooperation between Cuba and the U.S. has a long history, and during the Obama administration, a series of Memorandums of Understanding, better known as MOUs, were signed by the two countries and included several that focused on cooperation, particularly with respect to shared environmental problems. These MOUs provide the two countries, Cuba and the United States, with opportunities to cooperate for their mutual benefit. David Guggenheim, who is the founder and president of Ocean Doctor, will share the results of over 20 years of research in Cuba, including 100 visits and a series of cooperative projects that he undertook with his Cuban counterparts. David is a marine scientist, conservation policy specialist, ocean explorer, submarine pilot, author, and educator. As I mentioned, he is the founder and president of Ocean Doctor, dedicated to advancing the conservation of the world's oceans through scientific research, education, and community engagement. He is also an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University Advanced Academic Programs, teaching ocean stewardship and sustainability. As I mentioned, David has worked in Cuba for more than 20 years, leading collaborative research and conservation efforts. His book, which I'm holding up right now, is entitled The Remarkable Reefs of Cuba, Hopeful Stories from the Ocean Doctor, which was recently published. It details, and you will hear more about that tonight, a series of encounters he has had, not only with his human counterparts, but quite a few encounters with rather large inhabitants of marine life and Cuban ecosystems. He in particular is going to mention why over half of the world's coral reefs have suffered substantial damage, while the Cuban coral reefs, including the Gardens of the Queen, have survived in eminently better condition. Guggenheim has testified before Congress and international governmental bodies on environmental issues, and he regularly appears on television and radio and has been featured in a wide range of print media, including the New York Times. He recently spoke in New York at the Explorers Club, and he is someone who has been an enormous contributor to collaborative work between the U.S. and Cuba. Tonight, we have with us also Leigh Edmonds from Columbia University, who is the program assistant and without whom we could not function. In addition, I'm Margaret Crahan, the director of the Cuba program at Columbia University and senior research scholar. This evening, my role will be to gather together your questions, which we ask you to put in the Q&A room. I will gather them, eliminate duplications where they exist, and pass them on to David to answer. The next webinar on our schedule is going to move to a somewhat different topic, and that is the energy crisis in Cuba, which was exacerbated this past summer by the fires at the Matanzas fuel storage facility. Our speakers then will be Jorge Piñon, the US's leading expert on Cuban energy issues from the University of Texas at Austin, as well as Ricardo Torres, visiting professor at American University and formerly from Havana University. But tonight, as I said, we are going to hear from David Guggenheim and his very crowded friends, many of whom have fins. David?
My best buds. Margaret, thank you so much for a kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here. Lei, nothing works without you, of course, and thanks to everybody joining us today, both from Columbia Institute of Latin American Studies and well beyond. I know for Columbia, you're used to hearing presentations with more politics than I'm going to be talking about tonight, although they're certainly threaded throughout. But I'm going to be talking a lot about really backfilling a lot of our discussions that have led up to those politics and give you the day in the life of a white guy from Philadelphia, originally stumbling his way through Cuba and trying to make things happen. So with no further ado, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully, how's that look, Meg? Are we there? Oh, you're muted, but let's assume people can see that. All right, it's time for Lei. I just want to make sure you can see my screen. I need some confirmation.
I did.
Okay, all right, we're ready to go.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. We had a book launch. The book came out on October 1st and started the book tour up at the Explorers Club. These are some of my students and one dear Cuban colleague and friend. And I think we should just sort of get ourselves in the mood. So here's a quick video I've put together. Enjoy. Reminds me I've been out of the water for too long. Well, we are neighbors with Cuba, but unfortunately, sometimes neighbors don't get along. And, sadly, that's the case with us in Cuba. But sometimes neighbors have to get along. But cooperating is hard, both politically and logistically. I remember being stranded back in the old days when we had to take charters or go through third countries to get there. I was 20 hours into my journey, sitting in Cancun, delayed flights, and from the book I wrote, I realized that I could have flown from DC to Heathrow, grabbed the Heathrow Express into London, made my way to Buckingham Palace, had tea with the Queen, rest her soul, and returned to DC in less time than to travel to a country just 90 miles away. And to be conservative, I calculated that my tea with the Queen would be brief and not include scones and biscuits. But we have to cooperate with Cuba because we share the same ecosystem. We look at the major currents in the region that connect us, that don't divide us. We've learned that the larvae from fish can survive that journey. So it's conceivable that Cuban fish can grow up to be American fish. And sea turtles nest in Cuban waters and on Cuban beaches and forage in American waters and vice versa. If we want to save sea turtles, we have to work internationally. Way back when, our work, and I should mention that when I say our, I am speaking collectively of many different organizations, and it's not just me, it's many environmental organizations that have worked in Cuba to make these things happen. In my own experience, we started working with the University of Havana, the Center for Marine Research, which is pictured here. And this is their boat. This is actually their good boat. And it's made of ferro cement, which means basically it's made out of rock. It's made out of concrete. Not all that seaworthy for rough seas. And that's where we were going along the northwestern coast. So in the famous words, we're going to need a bigger boat. And at the time, boats were hard to find in Cuba. Tourist boats were way too expensive. And the only boat that really fit the bill was owned by Comandante de la Revolución, Guillermo Garcia Frias. He was very intimidating, very high up in the hierarchy. And the head of the Center for Marine Research organized a meeting, but said I had to do all the talking. So my Spanish wasn't great back then, so we brought an interpreter along. The interpreter, if you watch Seinfeld, was a low talker, couldn't hear him. And so I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm going to have to speak Spanish to the Comandante, which I did. And then he put his hand up and he said, momento. And I was scared to death that I had insulted him. And he said, ¿Cómo es posible un gringo está aquí de Washington, D.C., hablando español perfectamente? How's it possible a gringo from Washington, D.C. is here in my office speaking Spanish perfectly? Oh my God, I was so relieved. We got the boat and we used it for 10 years practically of expeditions to do the very first exploration. And this is a theme throughout collaborative research in Cuba, to do research that had never been done before. Cuba's Gulf of Mexico had never been explored before, and it resulted in the first ecosystem maps of that region. So unfortunately, there's so many areas of basic research that that Cuba, just because of economics, it just couldn't do. And it was great to be able to help them. And in the process, help the next generation of Cuban scientists spend time on the water, help them advance in their academic pursuits. And the woman in the foreground, Patricia Gonzalez, eventually became the head of the Center for Marine Research. She just stepped down after a 5-year tenure there. So to explain Cuba, we're going to take a detour to Alaska. Hope that's okay. I was in Alaska with Greenpeace on an expedition to explore the two largest underwater canyons in the world. Jemchug Canyon is much larger than the Grand Canyon, but it's underwater. And piloting a small submersible 2,000 feet down into these canyons, what would be the last thing you'd expect to see? Coral. It's different kind of coral, soft corals, but corals can be the oldest animals. Well, they are the oldest animals in the world. They can live beyond 4,000 years, which means they are witness to the birth of the Bronze Age, the completion of Stonehenge, the reign of the pharaohs of Egypt, the birth of Christ, and the finale of Breaking Bad. That's an old animal. And they're beautiful. Again, this is a complete darkness. And where you find corals, you find fish. They're so important to the ecosystem. This is bamboo coral, and this is a beautiful halibut enjoying some protection from that coral. And if you're lucky, you'll see a little octopus wrapped into the corals. And just like this brain coral off southern Cuba, they serve the same purpose. They provide great shelter to these other fish in the ecosystem, and they have many other benefits as well. Pop quiz: is coral an animal, mineral, or vegetable? Well, you already heard me say it's an animal, so that's part of it. Their tentacles, the stinging cells sting plankton that's floating by them, and the tentacles pull it in, and that's what they feed on. They're very happy just picking plankton that floats by. But they're also something of a mineral. They secrete, many of them, a calcium carbonate shell or surface, and they host symbiotic algae together, producing sugars, and the corals in return giving the algae a place to live. This is a great graphic by the Nature Conservancy. Corals have incredible value to the world economy. They estimate $9.9 trillion. 500 million people depend on them. Amazing statistic. More than half of all new cancer drug research focuses on marine organisms. Cuba has developed some new cancer medications based on coral reef chemicals. So it's very exciting to see the use of these coral reefs in that regard. And biodiversity, this is very important, that such a small percent, 1% of the Earth's surface may be responsible for 25% of the marine species. And just to give you a sense, this is not a coral species, but it's cool. The Bob Marley worm, the Census of Marine Life uncovered thousands of species we knew nothing about. We've barely explored the oceans, especially true of coral reef ecosystems. But this is Bob Marley. It's got the dreadlocks on top. And just to prove to you that we scientists do actually have a sense of humor. Corals are also important to coastline protection. Very front and center after the hurricanes that we've seen recently, especially the one in Fort Myers. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later. Tourism, obviously, and food production, very important contributions by coral reefs. But if we look at the planet and think about all of the coral reefs we have, if we can put them all together, they would barely fill the state of Texas. That's all we've got. And unfortunately, if you look at the red list from IUCN, look at the steepness of that curve of corals. That is scary, and many scientists feel that coral may be the most endangered animal on the planet. I mean, it's certainly one of the most endangered on the planet. Just, you can tell by the scope of that. And there's fear that we may lose all of our corals by the end of the century. So personally, I was lucky enough to go to a marine science camp called Sea Camp in the Florida Keys back in the 70s. It was stunning. It's why I became a marine biologist. There's the Florida Keys in all their glory. And this is what I saw. This is elkhorn coral, one of the most important reef building corals in the world. Just gorgeous. Sadly, 10 years later, this is what it looked like, covered with algae and practically dead. 10 years after that, it looked like this. 10 years later, and then 2014 is the last in this series. You can barely tell there was a reef there. It's really, heartbreaking right now. 80 to 90% of the corals in the Florida Keys are dead or practically dead. And that's why people like me dream of time machines. Wouldn't it be wonderful to go back in time and see those glorious reefs again? And I found my time machine. Somebody on this call probably knows what kind of car that is. I don't know if it's a Dodge or a Buick, but the point is, it's Cuba. Cuba came to my emotional rescue when it seemed like there was no hope for coral reefs. And here's a little montage of video I've put together. And remember that elkhorn coral? Look at how healthy this is. In fact, much of it seems healthier than what I remember as a teenager. Incredibly healthy, full of fish. Those are mostly grunt that you saw packed into those corals. Beautiful structures, and believe it or not, this is a barrier reef. There are the grunt. This is a barrier reef that goes on for about 30 miles along the southern Cuban coast. There you can just see the density of that. I also want to include elkhorn coral's cousin, which is staghorn coral. Not as abundant, but also as endangered. Elkhorn coral is actually on the endangered species list in the United States. And a rare form of coral, pillar coral, very abundant in southern Cuba, and sadly, functionally extinct in Florida waters. And a shout out to those same soft corals that we saw in Alaska, which are so important to the ecosystem. Sorry about the jumpiness of that video. So it's kind of a fair comparison. You look at the Keys in 1975 and you look at Jardines de la Reina, Gardens of the Queen, 40 years later. It's amazing. It's amazing to see that. And it becomes a living laboratory. It's seeing reefs the way they should be, an incredible opportunity to learn from. And for those of you who've seen the 60 Minutes piece, it's on YouTube. That's why we got the call from CBS, because they were going to do a piece on coral reefs, but they wisely realized that people weren't going to understand the story unless they could see what a healthy coral reef looked like. And that's why Anderson Cooper and company came to Cuba. And I had the white hair before Anderson because I'm older than him. So there. So what's happening here? Is it an accident of Cuba's unique history, or is it a result of strong laws and regulations? That's what the book explores. And the short answer is it's both. To get there, I think we have to look at American history and the history of the rest of the world. Now, overlaying all of this, what we hear about in the news is climate change. And indeed, we're seeing more and more bleaching of corals. Bleaching does not immediately kill corals, it weakens them. The symbiotic algae that I mentioned leaves the corals in a weakened state, and they often die. And we've heard incredible stories, just heartbreaking, of the Great Barrier Reef, one of the best managed reefs in the world off Australia, losing half of its corals since 1995 after major warming events passed through. If you haven't seen the documentary Chasing Coral, It's on Netflix. It's great. And it really goes into detail. They use time-lapse photography to really show how fast this happened. I should also point out that climate change has an evil twin. And that is because when that same carbon dioxide that we're emitting dissolves in water, we get a weak acid called carbonic acid, but it's strong enough to dissolve anything with a calcium carbonate shell, like coral. And if you think of the Great Cliffs of Dover, Great Cliffs of Dover are made up of small plankton called coccolithophores, which have these plates that you can see made of calcium carbonate. So what's scary about ocean acidification is affecting not only things that we can see, but it's affecting the base of the food chain as well. So these are serious problems as a result of fossil fuel emissions that we're dealing with. And this is, we don't hear as much about acidification, but we certainly hear a lot about climate change. But that's not the whole story. I often describe corals as the princess and the pea. They pretty much hate everything that we do. They're incredibly sensitive animals. And so when you look at it, it's not just the global threats, it's also things we're doing locally. I think this is a big part of the story. And it's in a way, a positive story, because even though we can't alone control global threats, we can control things locally. Now we dig into a little bit into our own history in the United States. Rachel Carson, 1962, the book Silent Spring really ushered in a new awareness of environmentalism in our country. And that started to grow and was punctuated by this image of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio on fire. That ended up on the front page of newspapers across the country. People were outraged and ultimately led to, this image in people's minds of, and this was real, pipes spewing toxic materials into our rivers and bays. And what happened? Of all people, Richard Milhouse Nixon sat down with his pen and signed into law a huge number of environmental legislative acts, including the Clean Water Act of 1972 to make all waters fishable and swimmable. He also established the EPA and NOAA. And there was this thing called bipartisanship. It goes back to ancient history that was prevalent, believe it or not, a Republican president taking care of all that. But we soon found that the Clean Water Act fell short. It dealt with pipes spewing pollution, but we were dealing with a new problem. Now, here's another pop quiz. What is the #1 irrigated crop in the United States? The corn, soybean, sorghum. Believe it or not, it's turf grass. More than 40 million acres of the continental US have some form of lawn on them. We are obsessed with our lawns, and what do? We fertilize them. This is a form of not point source pollution that comes out of a pipe, but non-point source pollution that's coming from many different places, including the lawns of suburbia. We have that competition of who can have the greenest lawn. And what happens when we fertilize? That fertilizer runs off. It runs off into the streams and rivers. I love this ad from New Jersey that talks about this problem. What does fertilizer do in the water? It does the same thing it does on your lawn. It promotes the growth of plants and algae, which choke our waterways. That algae can die. Bacteria go to work on it, suck all the oxygen out of the water, and you have dead rivers and streams and bays. So when I was in Ohio speaking to kids, this was during the Gulf oil spill, they said, what can we do to help? And I took this picture of a stream near their school and I said, don't over fertilize your backyard. There's literally something you can do in your own backyard to help the Gulf of Mexico. In Cuba, not so many lawns, maybe on Fifth Avenue around the embassies, but lawns aren't a big thing and fertilizing certainly not. The other thing that we have, of course, it's not just our lawns, it's big ag. It's mechanized industrial agriculture in the heartland using lots of fertilizer, lots of pesticides, and all of that runs off. Now that pink area that you see in the middle, all of that drains into the Gulf of Mexico. 44% of the continental US drains into the Gulf. And with it, lots of nutrients. And you can see that from space, you can see that from what's probably a drone here. And again, all of that algae that has grown from the stimulation of those nutrients from fertilizer, that is eaten up by bacteria, which uses oxygen. That is a dead zone the size of the state of New Jersey at the mouth of the Mississippi. Now, I spent a lot of years in South Florida, and this is the most beautiful place, the Everglades, and this is what it used to look like, a very slow flow across South Florida. People didn't like the Everglades very much. They considered it to be a most hideous region to live in, a perfect paradise for serpents, frogs, loathsome reptiles. So they did what any person who hates a giant wetland would do. They dredged it. And today it has become one of the most remarkable yet tragic human-managed ecosystems in the world. And it's not a well-managed system in the end. I mean, it's well-managed in many ways, but it has some serious flaws. And I want to, on the topic of nutrients, look at Lake Okeechobee, which sits at the middle of this. It sits right in the middle of agricultural land. So look at that algae growing, and that algae dies and becomes a toxic soup. And when the water rises to dangerous levels, they have to let that water out down the Caloosahatchee River and also on the East Coast. And if you think that that color is an exaggeration, this is coming out of the Caloosahatchee River. Can you imagine what this does for tourism and for fishing? It is disgusting. And but this is part of why we're involved in the largest restoration in history, the restoration of the Everglades. And there's more to this as well. And again, I'm setting up a contrast with Cuba. We've paved over so much of Florida and other areas. In my testimony to Congress, when we were trying to pass the bill to restore the Everglades, the last sentence I say, we've managed, this is very ironic, we've managed to make fresh water a pollutant because there's too much fresh water running off. This is a salinity chart from Rookery Bay at the close to Naples, down in Southwest Florida. And as you go higher on the graph, that's salty. Down on the graph is fresh water. Estuaries depend on a very delicate balance of salt and fresh water. And you can see that sudden drop from, salt, brackish water to fresh water. That kills things in estuaries. And estuaries are important nursery grounds for our oceans. And Naples Bay, some of the most expensive real estate in the world, is essentially a dead bay, again, because too much fresh water has run off due to so much of the fact that we're turning green infrastructure into gray infrastructure. So The Everglades will never be the same as they were, but there's an enormous project ongoing to restore them. And part of that includes the longest sewer system in the world, because until now, the primary way we got rid of waste was through septic tanks in limestone, which is quite porous. So those nutrients, again, that stimulate the growth of algae were getting out into the reef tract. And so this is also part of the restoration. A fair comparison is Zapata Swamp, Cienega de Zapata, untouched and absolutely beautiful, often called the Cuban Everglades, and not nearly as much replacement of green infrastructure with gray infrastructure. If you've ever stepped on one of these, you would remember it the rest of your life. This is the black spiny sea urchin, also known as diadema. And in one of perhaps the most widespread and fast pandemics in the world, in the ocean, the diadema almost disappeared from the oceans in 1983. This is a Caribbean species, so from the Caribbean in particular. And why is that a problem? They like algae. They munch on algae. They keep the reefs clean. And without them, that made the reefs more vulnerable to the growth of algae, especially as fertilizers are coming off of our shores. There's a report that came out a number of years ago, led by Jeremy Jackson, a famous scientist and colleague, that showed that we've lost about 50% of the corals in the Caribbean since 1970. The question is, why isn't there coral on the cover of this report? That's a parrotfish caught dead in a net. Beautiful fish. Notice the beak in the front. They like to eat coral. And actually what they do is they eat degraded coral. They like to eat algae just like the diadema. And here they are feasting away. And when you eat, wait for it. There it is. Okay, if you missed that, here's the instant replay. Yes, that is indeed parrotfish poop. So I shall read a short passage. 90% of a parrotfish's day is spent noisily eating coral reefs. It is common to see parrotfish swimming about, nonchalantly emitting a contrail of white sand from their anus, the end product of coral as it is pulverized passing through their digestive system. That sandy fish poop makes up a substantial part of the sandy halo surrounding coral reefs and coral heads. So fair warning, if you find yourself scuba diving and kneeling in the sand near a coral reef, it may well have traveled through the gut and anus of a parrotfish to get there. Feel proud. Fortunately, the Cuban palate doesn't quite like parrotfish very much, but in other places, Jamaica, the Virgin Islands, and elsewhere, this is in the Virgin Islands, parrotfish are enjoyed quite a bit. So the fact that there are more parrotfish in Cuba and that the diadema did better in Cuba, although they were affected, may have helped explain some of this, the fact that Cuba is doing better in terms of its marine ecosystems and coral reefs. The way we fish, this is actually a Russian trawler, but we are dragging tons and tons of fish out of the ecosystem. Part of it is we think of fish as crops like corn. We even use the term that we use for corn, maximum sustainable yield. Fish are not separate from the ecosystem. They're not crops. They have important roles to do, like that parrotfish that you saw earlier. And yet, again, Jeremy Jackson believes that overfishing, even beyond climate change, has been one of the, if not the most serious causes of ecological extinction in the oceans. In contrast, this is a Cuban fishing vessel, not very big, and fishing with hook and line. So a lot more sustainable, not always great. They do also fish with nets, and that can be a problem. But for the most part, much better than fishing in the US. And Cuba outlawed bottom trawling, dragging nets across the bottom, very destructive in the early 2000s. Many of you on this call know much more than I about Cuba's special period. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, this threw Cuba into a nation adrift. Its GDP immediately, within a few years, dropped 35%. Food production down nearly 50%. The average weight loss was, between 5 and 25%. People really were hungry. And there was a lack of fuel. The cameo, which you see here, was a way to get people around. The whole landscape changed and people really, really suffered. Itza Villapol is the equivalent of Julia Child in the United States, teaching people how to cook. She had a show on TV, and during the special period, she demonstrated a recipe for ropa vieja, or shredded beef, using banana peels. I don't know anybody who's actually tasted that recipe, but this is an idea of how serious things were getting. Killing a cow would get you a prison sentence of anywhere from 15 to 25 years. Very, very difficult period. But it also meant a lack of fertilizer from the Soviet Union. And all of those Russian tractors had no fuel and started rusting and disappearing into the ground. And Cuba was thrown back into a period of 100 years previous, or maybe more, of this sort of farming. And the fact that there were no nutrients, no fertilizers being used, reduced the amount of nutrients that would end up in the streams. But until now, this was just speculation. We really didn't have a measure of how much of a reduction or what those levels might be. And now, thanks to research by Paul Bierman at the University of Vermont, his research has shown that Cuban rivers have maybe a quarter of the nutrient load that you see in the Mississippi and other rivers in the United States. Unfortunately, once again, because of a lack of data, we don't know what Cuban rivers used to be. We don't have a time series, but that shows a promising level of nutrients that is not too high, but that is also something that requires study. What do those nutrient levels look like out where the coral reefs are living? And that era also really encouraged urban farms and the concept of organoponicos, like you see here outside of Havana. And by the way, I did not Photoshop the green that you see here. This is amazing looking lettuce. And it's reminiscent of the Victory Gardens that we had here in the United States. 20 million people participated in growing food in their own yards and in common gardens. And the concept stuck. Let me go back for just a second. What I was going to say is this is some of the best food you can eat in Cuba. It's still pretty expensive for the average Cuban, but it's organic. Now, Cuba didn't always go on this path. This was a path that was somewhat accidental. The original plans were much different. In 1966, Fidel said in a speech, "We have plans to develop all our water resources with the goal of not permitting one drop of water to reach the sea. So if you're a marine scientist like me, this is what you look like. Remember what I was talking about with estuaries. You don't want too much water, but you also don't want to choke them off. And in fact, a lot of this was done. Shrimp populations suffered as a result. There was a lot of damming, and Paul Bierman, during his research of rivers, was wondering why he kept running into these dams. But the result, possibly in part because of that and other reasons, maybe, again, speculation, but Cuba has healthy corals to show off. If you recognize that red watch cap, then you're of my generation, Jacques Cousteau. I've talked to his family. I've talked to many scientists in Cuba, and Jacques Cousteau visited the island in 1985. So here's a little short clip of history.
A fiery dawn finds a complex new mission beginning. As the rediscovery of the world lures Calypso to Cuba, the Caribbean's most intriguing island.
I really wish I could show you the whole thing. Come back another time. We'll have a party. It's fascinating. This is 1985, and Jacques Cousteau says the reef more rich than any I have seen in years. Remember, already the reefs of the Caribbean were degrading after the loss of diadema and overfishing. So it says a lot that way back in 85, he was already seeing that. Fidel and Jacques Cousteau met and were, one moment, sorry for all these noises. Jacques Cousteau invited Fidel aboard Calypso, and they became friends, and lifelong friends, and learned from each other. And at one point, Fidel poked Jacques Cousteau in his chest and said, "Why don't you have any Cubans on the Calypso?" So they put one on. My colleague and friend, Gaspar Gonzalez, was the first Cuban aboard Calypso and was aboard during their New Zealand expedition. But more important, Cousteau's environmental ethic, and I would hear about this from Cuban scientists and others, really started to affect Fidel Castro. This is a photo from the Rio Summit in 1992, and the story here is that all the state leaders were posing for a photograph, and Fidel grabbed Jacques Cousteau and said, "You need to be in this photograph too." So along with the heads of state, Jacques Cousteau appears in the photo, I guess as head of the oceans. I think that's appropriate. But what happened after that is extraordinary. And the influence on Fidel, I think, to me, really solidified when I could read in Fidel's own writing a letter to Bobby Kennedy, who we brought to Cuba a number of years ago after Bobby visited with Fidel, stated very clearly that it was Jacques Cousteau who really changed his mind about the oceans and the environment. And so Cuba's Law 81 of the environment is very strong. And many other NGOs have worked with this and this law and helped implement it. But look at this, the basic right of society and its citizens, the right to a sound environment. Those are strong words. And the establishment of Cuba's network of protected areas, 25% of their waters now protected in protected areas. And just a couple of years ago, 2019, Cuba became one of only 10 countries in the world to include the confrontation of climate change in its constitution. Can you imagine having that discussion here? So some of the things that really give me hope are those strong laws, are Cuba's commitment to its environment. I think we're all happy in our country and around the world, but especially here, Teddy Roosevelt and the Antiquities Act and all of those things that led to our national park system. We've preserved about 14% of our lands. We're not quite there in our waters, but we're getting there. And the thing about protecting our ecosystems, it's an insurance policy, and it protects other parts of the ecosystem. You protect an ecosystem intact, and that protects all species and those complex interactions, including fish, which again are not separate, they're part of the ecosystem. Here's some figures worldwide. They change, and it also changes based on how you define what a protected area is. But my idea of a protected area is no take. You take nothing out and you leave only bubbles. And in the United States, Papahanaumokuakea is one of the largest protected areas, established originally by George Bush. This is in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and then doubled in size by Barack Obama. Again, this strange thing called bipartisanship. Somehow this was done by two presidents with very different philosophies and two different political parties. The thing about protected areas, as I mentioned, they are not all the same. This is a protected area in Cuba, Punta Francés, in the Isle of Youth, but fishermen from Pinar del Rio are fishing illegally in that reserve. So it's interesting. You've got one ministry fighting another ministry, the Ministry of Food versus the Ministry of the Environment. So unless you're managing these ecosystems, including enforcement, you've got a problem. One other problem facing coral reefs, including in Cuba, is the lionfish. Beautiful fish, but it belongs in the Indo-Pacific. They can get huge if you haven't seen some of them. Their spines are poisonous, but not lethal. And they taste delicious, by the way, as long as you take the spines off. They're believed to have entered US waters in Miami. We're not quite sure why, but look how fast they've spread through the Caribbean, including Cuba. But if you take an ecosystem like Gardens of the Queen, a huge protected area where you have predators, you've got a chance to really help that ecosystem protect itself. Right now, we depend on divers like this one to spearfish them. But what if we could teach sharks how tasty lionfish are? And that's being done in places like Honduras as well. There just aren't enough divers in the water to help take care of this problem. But again, a healthy ecosystem that protects all of its inhabitants, including that black grouper, which also seems to like lionfish. That is a huge leg up. Another thing that gives me hope is the fact that we've changed our perspective on the environment. The environment used to be free. We could dump anything into it and take anything out that we wanted. In some places, that's still true. But our attitudes have changed, and we're looking more at the concept of environmental economics. Remember before I talked about how effective corals are on shoreline protection and reducing wave height? This is a study done by World Resources Institute that calculated the economic value and the value to shoreline protection of coral reefs and mangroves is greater than tourism and fisheries combined. And again, that's largely because corals can reduce 97% of wave energy, 84% of wave height. And again, in a world of stronger and more frequent hurricanes, this becomes very, very important. If you look at the economics of building seawalls versus restoring coral reefs, it's a no-brainer. It's 15 times less expensive to focus on restoring the ecosystem. And again, Cuban law, socialist country, the economic evaluation of biological diversity. Environmental economics is present in Cuban law. So far, though, it's an unfulfilled legal mandate, and that's where in the past we've been helping Cuba, holding environmental economics workshops in Cuba, in the United States, and trying to convey methods on how to implement environmental economics in policy decision-making. And tourism becomes a big part of this. I'm going to skip over this and leave that for Q&A, but in parts of the Pacific, they did studies looking at the value of a shark, worth a few $100 on your dinner plate, worth $2 million for tourism over its lifetime. We did a report on the dangers of mass tourism and the opportunities for Cuba. And that was out of fear, basically, after things started to open up. I'm going to skip over the tourism other than to show you that's my grandmother in 1930 on her honeymoon in 1930 on the beaches of Havana. So Cuba is no stranger to tourism. And the idea is how to remove the incentive for mass tourism. I'll come back to some of those slides later, but I want to stay true to my time limit. These are slides of the Isle of Youth. But the bottom line is Cuba hasn't gone through the mass tourism wave that has done so much damage to the Caribbean. Visitors are willing to pay a premium for an authentic experience, like one you get staying in a casa particular, a private home. And there are also opportunities here to create the right incentives among residents of those small communities to protect their natural resources as opposed to exploiting them. This happens to be the first bed and breakfast and dive center in the community of Cocodrilo in the Isle of Youth. If we have time, somebody asked me about whale poop. Now, we've talked about some other forms of poop. Whale poop has an interesting story, but I won't go into it right now. So the idea is, if we can deal with local threats, can that make corals more resilient to the global threats? And I think the answer is yes. It's a serious issue. If you look at this graph, you can see the bleaching events indicated by the vertical lines. This is getting worse at a very, very rapid rate. And even if we stabilize, and we have the meetings going on right now, even if we stabilize, we may lose 70 to 90% of our corals in a very short amount of time by the end of this century. So how do we deal with that? It's a form of triage. We focus on the reefs that are the healthiest, have the best chance of surviving, that would eventually be able to repopulate the degraded reefs downstream. And a study was done in 2018, forget the colors here, but you can just look at some of the locations around the world, identifying 50 areas with the best chance of survival and resilience and the potential to repopulate those downstream areas. And if we look a little closer at just the Caribbean, we see that Cuba represents 5 of those 50. That's 10% of the world's coral reefs with the best chances of surviving and repopulating other regions in the world. That's why protecting coral reefs in Cuba becomes so important. There are other methods in also being practiced, selective breeding for corals that have the best resistance to climate change, genetic modification using technologies such as CRISPR to help corals develop resistance to a warmer climate, and restoring corals by replanting them. That has problems, of course, because if you're replanting them in the same hot water, same nutrient-rich water, that can be an issue. And all of this leads up to environmental diplomacy that you heard Meg mention earlier. Joint efforts in marine science have been considered one of the most successful areas of collaboration. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that scientists have succeeded where diplomats failed. That's, prior in the old days, in the Bush days, and maybe the early Obama days before the normalization of relations. But we had very strong collaboration. A shout out to Senator Whitehouse. We held meetings with him, that is Fabian Pina, on his right, noted scientist in Cuba, who that is the Benjamin Franklin dining room in the State Department. This is before the normalization of relations. That's very important. And we sat down in his office a few months earlier with the Cuban ambassador, with Josefina Vidal, who was head of North American relations, and mapped out what eventually became the first MOU between the United States and Cuba. And that had to do with marine conservation. The first few memoranda of understanding came from that. The final thing I'll say is I'm given hope by the next generation. This is Alaska, Barrow, Alaska, the Virgin Islands. I've been traveling to all 50 states, this is Kansas, to talk to kids about the oceans. And I've been learning from them, like these kids in Georgia. So I'm about halfway there. And I'm also finding that our Cuban students also understand and they care about their environment. I call my students at Johns Hopkins the new ocean doctors, and I think our next generation is definitely ready to take the helm, and that gives me a lot of hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I will stop sharing my screen. There we go. Meg, back to you. I think you're muted.
It's not doing anything. No, David, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll now move
Thank
on.
you.
Pardon?
Thank you.
We'll move on to questions now. I'd like to encourage our audience to put any questions you have into the Q&A function. We already have a couple, rather than in the chat room function. So if you have a question and you've put it in the chat room, I'd encourage you to put it into the Q&A, and we'll start with the questions. Timothy Vogel has a question relating to tourism. And he's interested in building several citizen science projects that visiting expeditions, ecotourism ventures can run while they are in local waters. Is there such CS efforts being organized in Cuba? David?
When I was last in Cuba before COVID, we were developing such a project with the Department of Tourism at the University of Havana. And the idea was to actually connect communities, small communities, to work together on such ecotourism projects. Not every community is going to have something that people want to visit and enjoy, but other communities can connect. Maybe they're providing food, maybe they're providing labor, etc. Maybe there places to shop for tourists. But the idea is to provide economic benefit that stays local, that provides incentive to protect the environment, and is an alternative to mass tourism.
Thank you, David. Our next question is from Asa Miller, who is a sophomore at Edgemont High School in Scarsdale, New York. And he wanted to thank David for your fascinating presentation and book, which I bought the day it came out.
Thank you.
His question is, he plans to go to Cuba in February. I am visiting the Isle of Youth, where I am doing coral restoration work with a diver from the area named Reynaldo Hernandez. I am looking for a scientist to mentor my research. Would you be at all interested?
Of course. Of course. And I know Reynaldo, also known as, more commonly known as Nene, he is a great leader of that community in the Isle of Youth. And that's unfortunately due to time, had to skip over that part of the presentation, but you saw the dive center, the little bed and breakfast and dive center, that is in his community there, Cocodrilo. I'm amazed that you're going there. It's a very hard place to get to, especially now after COVID. They canceled a lot of the flights, I'm just have so much respect for you. So please get in touch. I'd be delighted to help you with that work.
Thank you, David. You're going to have to scroll up for me. And my thing is not scrolling up. Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Laura Fair. Please tell us about whale poop.
Yay!
You've been dying to tell us all about that. Go ahead.
I am a biologist, so my presentations tend to be poop rich, and this relates to environmental economics. One of our new projects actually does not relate directly to Cuba. It relates to the Everglades, and it all started when I was chair of the Great Whale Conservancy. And one of the other board members is a guy named Ralph Shami, who spent 25 years at the International Monetary Fund. So what is a guy from the IMF doing with whales? And why did the IMF eventually publish a paper on whales? That seems incongruous. Well, what Ralph was so moved when he saw these magnificent great blue whales, the largest animal that's ever inhabited planet Earth. And he got back, and he's one of those guys that stays up all night. He got his iPad out and did some calculations on the amount of carbon a whale sequesters from the atmosphere. Now, there's plenty of carbon in a whale's body, but that's dwarfed by the amount of carbon that is sequestered from the atmosphere because the whale is out there a-pooping in areas of the sea where there is not much in the way of nutrients. So those whales are stimulating the growth of phytoplankton, plant plankton, and that plankton is actually a good thing. And it sinks to the bottom, and it is sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So just with regard to carbon, he calculated that a single whale could be worth $3 million. And if you multiply that, we're down to about 1% of the whales that used to exist. If you multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of whales that used to exist, you start to get into huge numbers. And they pejoratively would call him the whale whisperer at the IMF and all of that. Well, we're working together on something similar in the Everglades. A colleague of mine who runs Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, you saw the salinity graph from there. Beautiful place, full of manatees and sawfish and all manner of life. He's part of the Everglades restoration effort, a lot of it caused by changes in water flow. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we could have restoration pay for itself? And what Ralph has been doing and what we're doing together is figuring out a way to make that happen. Now, there are a lot of carbon offset projects in the world focused on blue carbon, which has to do with the oceans, like mangroves and seagrasses. They're becoming a dime a dozen. Not to say they're bad, but the economics tend to be an afterthought. Now, for a guy who spent 25 years with the IMF, the economics are baked in. They're the centerpiece. So what he's done is turned the economics of this on its head so that carbon is no longer a cost, it's an investment. So we're working with the state of Florida. They're intrigued by this to bring in private dollars, private investment into public lands for restoration, where those investors might get a return on their investment. And benefits, financial benefits obviously accrue to the state, they would accrue to local communities, and everybody wins. This is all made possible by the mushrooming cost of carbon. And it's just fascinating to me that we could develop a project, again, under that umbrella of environmental economics that could make all
Need your
this
help
happen.
again.
I should also say that Ralph was a TED speaker in Vancouver this year, up on the stage there with Al Gore and Elon Musk and the rest of them. If that video is available, check it out because he's a great speaker. My students were really excited about this. And the project in Florida actually came as a result of a project of my students at Johns Hopkins who were so inspired by Ralph. And I'm excited, very excited about that work. Sorry, long answer to a short question about whale poop.
Thank you, David. Our next question is, David, you mentioned bed and breakfast and dive center in the Isle of Youth. Now, are there a number of such places where interested travelers could see the reefs and also visit the Jardín de la Reina? How can one find them and plan such trips?
Well, we run trips to Cuba, so I will do some shameless self-promotion. Our trips used to go to the Isle or to Gardens of the Queen. We still run a couple of, or have planned a couple of those, but those require being on a liveaboard the entire time. And so you don't really get to interact with the communities as much. Now, the wildlife is spectacular. We've moved a lot of our efforts to the Isle of Youth, which you saw. Their reefs are beautiful as well. You saw that picture of the trunkfish in front of the elkhorn coral, nibbling on a jellyfish. But that's where the illegal fishing is going on. So the reefs aren't quite as healthy, but you also have fantastic communities around there. Now, in terms of accommodations, there's one hotel, but there are lots of bed and breakfasts. But the only bed and breakfast I'm aware of, the Casa Particular, is the one that you saw. There were two others awaiting approval. And the reefs around that area on the south part of the Isle of Youth in Cocodrilo are beautiful. They're really, shallow, so you can snorkel there. Anyway, get in touch, David at oceandoctor.org, and I'm happy to just go on and on and on about how beautiful that island is and how unusual it is. And that's not to take anything away from Gardens of the Queen. Really, really very spectacular. You'll also find other groups leading trips. We're not the only ones. So you can just Google around and find groups. Just beware of certain groups offering to take you down on anything but a people-to-people license or a support for the Cuban people license. I've heard of some organizations taking people down on religious licenses, and not to say that the ocean isn't a religion, but that could get you into trouble.
Yes, let me add a footnote to what David just said. During the Trump administration, sanctions were imposed that prohibit U.S. citizens from staying in hotels anywhere in Cuba. So you must stay in a B&B, which there are many B&Bs that are very comfortable and well located for your pursuits. But make sure you check with the Treasury Department first about the restrictions.
Yeah,
So
there's
you did.
just a couple
David.
hotels, very few hotels that Americans are allowed to stay in. That's because it's the Ministry of Defense that oversees tourism in Cuba, which sounds a little crazy, but it's a matter of national security through the Cuban lens. Still, there are some hotels, but I think staying at a private home, you still have your own private room and air conditioning and all the amenities, and they will dote on you and feed you the best food you've ever had, and you'll get to know some very special people. So I think it's a superior experience, frankly.
Thank you, David. The next question is also about visiting Cuba, but this one is as a volunteer to get involved with reef preservation and restoration. What suggestions do you have to pursue that interest?
Well, I think we just heard from the high school student about one such effort on the Isle of Youth. There's also an effort like that going on in the Bay of Pigs, and I'm familiar with the people who direct that project. It's very similar to the slide you saw of work being done in the Florida Keys. It's less, I think it's more successful in Cuba because, again, those local factors have been addressed. So the coral has a better chance of growing. It also begs the question, is it necessary at all to do that activity? And I'm not sure that that's been well studied, but I think one thing that is very interesting to me is, even if it's not necessary, we can learn from those studies, from the replanting that the Cubans are doing to help guide our efforts in the Keys and elsewhere. That's my thought. So those are two areas. I'm happy to connect you with the right people that I'm familiar with.
Do you have a mouse?
Yeah. Our next question is from Ilse Berkens.
Hi,
Are
Ilse.
you a friend of David's? Are you introducing the concept of One Health to the ecologists, veterinarians, medical doctors in Cuba?
Hasn't really been a focus. If I'm understanding the question correctly, our focus has been more ecosystem wide, or is that what you're getting at?
She can't. Yes.
Or maybe I misunderstood the question. Scrolling through here. Ilse, if you can maybe reword that a little bit so I can give you a better answer. But we can maybe skip to the next question and we can come back.
Yeah. The next question is, does the U.S. government fund joint projects with Cuba to protect the ocean where the U.S. waters are likely to benefit? Does the U.S. permit such funding from government and private sources? And does Cuba accept the funding for joint projects with U.S. entities?
Oh boy, that's a hard question.
We didn't promise you softballs.
In the past, after the normalization of relations and after the initial memorandum of agreement were established, there was a real push for joint research. It wasn't so much, well, I guess part of it was funded by the US government, but it was a joint effort. I think the idea was to go and do expeditions. Notably, one of them was the Twilight Zone expedition to look at corals deeper than diver depth. These are corals that are very poorly studied, just like the ones in the Bering Sea that I was looking at, but those are much deeper. And so a lot came out of that expedition, and that was a great example of government and government collaboration as opposed to the NGOs, although I would have liked to have a ride on that ship too. But after the Trump administration came in, it really chilled those relations and pretty much slowed things to a crawl. I think Biden has rolled back a number of the Trump restrictions, but I think it's a slow restart of the government to government work right now. Now, in terms of government funding for projects in Cuba, that has always been difficult. If, say, Ocean Doctor or Environmental Defense Fund or another NGO wanted to do a project in Cuba, getting federal, US dollars from the government to fund that not only was difficult on the US side or next to impossible, but the Cubans would not accept that. It was kind of the kiss of death for a project. And one of the things, if you're going to do a project in Cuba, is you need to be ready for an interview by one of the ministries to ask you specifically, where is the funding coming from? And so I haven't been back since before COVID, just before the COVID outbreak. So there's a lot of catching up I need to do to see what the latest is. But that's where I left off. I'm pleased to see the lifting of many restrictions by the current administration. The hotel restriction stands, and very peculiar. You're allowed to have meetings, but you're not allowed to have workshops. So, like many things, Cuba regulations don't quite make sense.
Nor the US's.
Right, exactly, the US regulations.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Ilse has come back with a explanation. One Health, ecosystem health, animal health, human health, interconnected, and all need to be addressed at the same time.
Okay.
Why can
not in as many words. That concept has, I think, rolled into things like marine protected areas, where there's a good understanding and appreciation that, again, you're protecting all elements of the ecosystem. You're protecting manatees, you're protecting fish, you're protecting coral reefs, and then you're also benefiting human beings through ecotourism, through fishing, and so on. So I think that that to me seems to be, if I'm, again, my apologies if I'm not responding quite right to your question, but that to me seems to be the way that the Cubans are getting at that issue, with a real focus on protecting large areas. And in the world of protected areas, bigger is better, and it's very, very impressive. Hand in hand with that is enforcement, of course, and providing the right incentives to protect those areas. So I always say, you may have missed it, but I showed a slide of a huge boat, like a war boat, and that's what I thought the enforcement vessel for Gardens of the Queen would look like, and turns out to be like a bathtub that you could walk faster than. And the real enforcement in that area is the housekeeper on a liveaboard boat. She knows every boat that belongs there. She's making a great salary. She's going to protect that area as well as anything else, because she has the incentive to protect the integrity of that ecosystem.
Okay, thank you, David. We now have a question from John Hartman. Has there been any effort to reduce how much fish we eat, similar to the way we have been encouraged to eat less beef to protect the environment and our hearts?
There is in two ways. One is we have reached the point, well, let me qualify that. I don't think there has been an effort to reduce the amount of seafood we eat. To the contrary, I think people may be eating more fish as they look for alternatives to beef. So then that puts pressure on fish stocks and sustainability of fish. We've crossed the point where now most of the fish we eat are farmed fish, a lot in China. A lot of the salmon we eat is farmed in British Columbia. There's good farming and bad farming. Sadly, salmon from British Columbia are one of the worst fish that you can eat. They've commoditized salmon, so we come to expect it in our diets. So hand in hand with the fact that we haven't really reduced our consumption. American consumption tends to be much lower than other countries in general, but it really comes down, I always say it comes down to the two most powerful weapons we have with us at all times: our smartphone and our purse or our wallet. Go to a restaurant, ask lots of questions to your server or at the grocery or elsewhere. Where is this fish from? Is it sustainably caught? How is it caught? And very often they won't know the answer. There's a great app called Seafood Watch from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which actually uses GPS. So you can actually look very quickly at local fish as well. And you can help educate your server, your grocer, and so on. And, by asking annoying questions, this is how the world changes, because you're the one who's got the money. You need to provide the economic incentive for them to serve you something sustainable. And I think a lot of this comes down to sustainability. And that includes sustainable aquaculture as well.
Thank you, David. We have a question from John McAuliffe.
Hi, John.
The economically most significant part of tourism for Cuba are the large beach resorts along the northern coast from Varadero to Holguin. That is where the overwhelming majority of Canadians and Europeans go. What is the impact on the corals and environmental conditions on the North Shore?
I haven't spent a lot of time in Varadero. I don't like it very much. But similar to areas that are heavily visited near Havana, there are there's degradation of corals for a number of reasons, some of which I've talked about tonight. Some people talk about sacrificial areas in order to benefit others. People will always gravitate toward that sort of dense mass tourism model. And for example, there's a beach in the Virgin Islands, which is, every time a cruise ship comes in, they dump them on that same beach, but it prevents destruction of other areas. So they're pretty much trashing one area to the benefit of others. So you're right to point that out. That is a big source of income. I think the Canadians and Europeans are crazy because I think they should see all the other beautiful parts of Cuba. But again, I'm a believer in the small scale model. It works in places like the Bay of Pigs. That's a community that works together. For example, they've built common areas for people to eat behind several homes that are all working together. It's a very pleasant experience. And again, I think when it comes down to it, if you visit a place like Cuba and have a chance to have an authentic experience, that's something that many people are willing to pay a premium for. And the visitors that have gone to Cuba with me, those are the experiences they remember the most, are sitting down, talking with Cubans, interacting with them, snorkeling with them, whatever it might be. That's something very special about Cuba that other islands just don't offer, I think. And, John, the bottom line is if there's an alternative, as I said, to mass tourism, that is so important to the future growth of Cuba. And so far, there's great pressure to the contrary.
This is a follow-up question from John McAuliffe. It's fine for small groups and independent travelers to stay in B&Bs. However, large tour groups and most conferences require access to hotels. The Gaviota hotels were blocked because of the military link, even under Obama. What Trump did was prohibit all hotels, including those with no relationship to the military. The only permitted hotels are the new ones that the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the U.S. Department of Treasury has not added to the prohibited list so far anyway. It would be useful if the Biden administration at least undo Trump's sanctions.
Yeah, you raise an important point. Even though I should say we are allowed, in talking with Robert Muse, one of the foremost experts on Cuba sanctions and Cuba policy, what I understand is that it is legal to hold meetings, not workshops, to hold meetings in hotel facilities. You're just not allowed to sleep there. Again, here we go with the bizarre nature of sanctions and regulations. So that solves one part of the problem. You can get your group together to have a meeting using hotel facilities. But if they can't sleep there, you're absolutely right. That creates a logistical challenge. If you've got people spread out in homes across a neighborhood in Havana, it adds to transportation, it adds to communication issues. It's a big issue. So reopening, or providing access again to those hotels is not a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing. I think what's negative is if we have further pursuit of a mass tourism model where we see these high rises popping up right on the beach like Veradero, which in some ways looks like South Florida on the Miami side. And you look at Cancun, which is sort of the poster child of the mass tourism model. They built all these high rises on the beach. They displaced not only an ecosystem, but also a culture. They had a thriving agriculture economy there. And the coral reefs are suffering as a result of a lot of pollution, especially nutrient pollution getting out to the reefs. So, and then the whole thing of spring break. I don't think there's a Spanish translation for that. I've tried to explain it, and I have to use photographs. But this is not the kind of tourism that Cuba wants. And I'm afraid, fearful, that they could go in that direction because of the economic pressures that they feel, especially now after COVID pretty much shut down tourism for a couple of years.
Thank you, David. A question from Timothy Vogel. Does David have a good story in the vein to share about his experiences with budding young Cuban scientists?
Too many. Some in the book, but I'll tell you one that it's a little bit different, just the one that popped to mind. We were talking about the Isle of Youth and Cocodrilo, and talking about new projects that involve ecotourism, that might involve doing research, that combine the two. And we got a lot of the young people together. Now, this is a community with 50% unemployment, and it's sort of true of Cuba as a whole. You've got these incredibly talented young people just dying to do something creative and exciting and advance their careers, and feel frustrated that they can't get there. So when we started talking about these things, they got very excited. And what was fun was that they sort of self-selected. So a couple of these young people said, oh yeah, I want to get in the water and be a dive leader and lead these people. And some of them said, oh yeah, I want to teach people in the classroom and bring them together with our students and do exchange. And there was this one kid, he's probably 17 years old. He goes, I want to stay inside and do all the computer work. But, why not? That's what he wants to do. He has a chance to really use it for an important purpose. I just got a kick out of that because he's living on this amazing point with all these coral reefs. He wants to stay inside and, punch everything into the computer. But hey, that's how the economy works.
Right. David, we're drawing to a close, and you no doubt can provide information about how to communicate with Ocean Doctor. If you could indicate how to access your website.
Of course. Ocean Doctor, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization through which we do all our work in Cuba, is oceandoctor.org. And if you want to learn more about the book, just go to remarkablereefs.com.
Yes. And as I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded. It will be edited and it will be posted on YouTube and also on the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University's website. So if you type in just Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University, you will be able to pull it up. All of our webinars going back several years are available both on YouTube as well as on the Institute for Latin American Studies website. And as I mentioned earlier, our next webinar will be December 6th, and our two speakers will be Professor Jorge Piñón, who worked for 32 years in the oil industry around the world, and he is currently a professor at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas in Austin, and he will be speaking. And together with Jorge will be Ricardo Torres, who's a visiting professor at American University in Washington, D.C. currently, and previously was at the University of Havana. And they will both be speaking about the current energy challenges in Cuba, blackouts, brownouts, accidents such as the Matanzas fire last August, etc. And that will be a joint presentation by Jorge and Ricardo. And now I want to thank our audience for all your many questions, not to mention your attention. Leigh Edmonds, who has saved my life here this evening several times. And finally, but most of all, Dr. David Guggenheim, the author of the incredible Reefs, which is really a delightful read, having just finished it. And so David's work has been spectacular, but also the visuals he has provided us have been spectacular. So thank you very much, David, and look
Thank
forward
you.
to your next documentary.
Thank
And
you
book.
so much.
You're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it.
Good night, all. We'll see you on December 6th.